I do recall getting different information from my family and my community versus what the media was saying about Cuba almost throughout my entire life. And professors even in high school and then of course in college, not so much in professional school because I didn't study that area. Usually the contradiction in perspective was very drastic. That a lot of my professors in college talked about Cuba as a productive socialist state with a high standard of living and free medical for everyone involved and free school. Perspective from my family and my friends, and I respect this opinion more, having an understanding that they've gone through the process and they actually grew up there and spent most of their adult lives there, was that those particular achievements associated with communism were not really the product of Castro's revolution, but rather part of the history of Cuba already, that in the 50s had advances, had a standard of living comparable to the US. So I did receive a lot of contradictory information. In fact, I remember one time specifically watching the evening news and seeing Peter Jennings in Havana broadcasting.
Have surely told him that in those 30 years, this island has been transformed. Castro has delivered the most to those who had the least, and for much of the third world, Cuba is actually a model of development. Education was once available to the rich and the well-connected. It is now free to all. And when the Cuban dictator Batista left the country for good, only a third of the population could read and write. Today, the literacy rate is 97%.
And I was struck by how he described the island. A socialist state with free medical care and standard of living that was the best in Latin America. Maybe he didn't say exactly that, but that was the gist of it. And it shocked me because everything I was hearing from my community and my family was that a lot of those things were not the product of a socialist revolution in Cuba, but were things that many Cubans already had before Castro took over. And in fact, that what happened during Castro's regime was really a deterioration of those things and not a betterment of those conditions. So that's one example, and I was absolutely shocked when I heard him say that.
Medical care was once for the privileged few. Today it is available to every Cuban, and it is free. Some of Cuba's health care is world class, in heart disease, for example, in brain surgery. Health and education are the revolution's great success stories. And whatever the mistakes of this revolution, Cubans tend to blame the Communist Party or the bureaucrats. Rarely do they blame Castro.
American media and other intellectuals relying on data that comes out of Cuba, which is not always legitimate. The World Health Organization for many years put out data that Cuba had an infant mortality rate that was superior to many other countries, and they put out literacy rate levels that said that Cuba had an excellent literacy rate. Well, if you study those things and you go in depth on them and you challenge them, I think you'll be surprised by what you see. For example, I've read that one of the reasons that Cuba has so many doctors per 1,000 people in the population is because to become a doctor in Cuba is no longer as rigorous as it used to be. So if you put people through a shortened program, you're going to produce more doctors. And then the numbers look really good, but really is the quality of care that good? Same with literacy rate. From what I've read, only people in a certain age group are measured as to whether they're literate or not. And they exclude older populations. So if you're working with a limited group and you only test them, sure, you'll have a 98% literacy rate, but it's false data. I think that international organizations and the US have been not very critical of the data coming out of Cuba, and many times taking it at face value, and that distorts the reality, and it distorted the truth. I've yet to see an article or news coverage that really explains and tries to articulate the kind of moral dilemma that this decision is for Cuban Americans. We all want to help our families. I personally have dozens of cousins in Cuba that I have not seen in 25 years. I'm close to 30 now, and I came when I was 5 years old. We want to help them. We want to improve their standard of living. And the decision to stop sending them money and stop sending them food is emotionally wrenching and a great dilemma for us, because we want to promote democracy, but at the same time we don't want to continue to give Castro and his regime hard currency in which to continue the oppression. So either way, we lose. It's a very difficult decision. But the decision has been made now by Clinton and the administration. Cut off US dollars by family member to Cuba. I support that because even though it will create, I have to acknowledge, more misery now, and it hurts me to say that, because these are my family in a sense that will be hurt. I think it's one of the only ways finally get rid of Castro and promote significant change and complete change, not temporary measures. The delicateness and the complexity of that dilemma for Cuban Americans has been portrayed in the media very well. The decisions to engage Cuba in economic relations is often portrayed as just one step of a policy to hope that those economic relations will eventually lead to democracy. For Cuban Americans, it's much more complicated. It is part emotional, and that kind of coverage has not been made yet from what I can see from the US media. The portrayal of Cuban exiles, I believe, by the US media has been most times pretty balanced, but there's a segment out there of the media that I believe associates the Cuban exile movement or cause exclusively with a right-wing, emotional group of people who don't express themselves in a logical way and whose expression is based out of anger and emotion as opposed to out of reason. I think that's completely false. Most of our positions are not the result of anger, rage, and emotion. They are legitimate expressions. They are logical given our history. And it's really a disservice to our community when the media portrays us as a bunch of right-wing radicals. It's a very effective tool, though, because what it does is it dismisses our position. I think there's a couple of things the U.S. media could do to improve their coverage. Whenever they do a story on Cuba, they seek out different views on the status of Cuba or different opinions and represent those as opinions when they are opinions, and only represent facts which are verifiable and true, as opposed to, for example, relying on the propaganda of the Cuban government as fact, but rather say this is information as reported to us from the Cuban government. It has not been independently confirmed. That they could do. Second thing they could do, like I said, is try to give balanced reporting by interviewing different groups within the Cuban American community and different groups which represent different positions toward Cuba, as opposed to just advocating one position in regard to relations with Havana. I think another thing that they've done which has allowed Castro to stay in power is that they have, through editorials and through other types of media representations, armed that segment in the U.S. community that wants to engage in relations with Castro and that wants to further that kind of socialist movement around the world with a lot of good information. I recently read, or more like a year, 2 years ago, an article in GQ about vacationing in Cuba. I was shocked. What is an article in GQ doing about vacationing in Cuba? First of all, U.S. citizens are not allowed to vacation in Cuba, so that seemed like just a bad editorial decision to run a story on that. The interesting thing about the article was that it indirectly said that one of the perks of going to visit Cuba was that there was a lot of available women. And this was very insulting, because what they were alluding to, and I think they kind of mentioned it in a backhand way, was that there's a lot of prostitution in Cuba. Well, why is there a lot of prostitution in Cuba? Because there's a lot of poverty in Cuba, and that poverty has produced prostitution and other forms of illegal activities. The article sort of winked at that and said, well, there's a lot of drunk tourists in Cuba taking advantage of the local social scene, and what they were referring to was prostitution. That to me is shocking and revolting, that they would have an article in a men's magazine in a way suggesting that you go down there and exploit the poverty because there's a lot of prostitution. And in fact, it's well known that in Cuba, foreigners, Canadians, South Americans often go for a good time to exploit those very results of poverty, such as prostitution. So that article indirectly promoted tourism in Cuba. whether by U.S. Citizens, which would be legal, I believe, in most cases, or by Canadians, or by anybody else who read that article. And what does that kind of tourism do for Castro? Well, that tourism, promoted by, in this example, the U.S. media, gives Castro more dollars in which to prop up his government. It allows Castro the much-needed currencies to continue his regime and his system of apartheid. And the case of tourism is specifically on point because tourism is a very good example. The tourist hotels in Cuba are only for non-Cubans. The beaches that are the most beautiful have been closed off and are only for the tourists because it's a state-run tourism industry which wants to promote tourism in any way it can, including the backhanded acceptance and marketing of prostitution, and at the same time rejecting or not allowing Cubans to enjoy their own beaches or access to those special hotels, special restaurants, special stores which only cater to tourists, only accept US dollars no matter where you come from, and provide Castro with the much needed resources to continue his system. So that's one very specific example of how the US media, apart from what I believe is the other kind of general slanted view toward Castro and his government, promotion of tourism there is, I believe, one way that media has allowed Castro to continue in power. An indirect way, but a significant way. How the US media, in I think a fairly biased way, is influencing US policy towards the Cuban government has been the recent outpouring and significant number of editorials in U.S. papers which call for direct dialogue with Castro, lifting the embargo, and these are all portrayed as legitimate, significant steps to end the misery in Cuba. But I believe that they are not legitimate because they are not balanced editorials and they are not based on what I believe is a complete understanding of the picture in Cuba. Many of the editorials and suggestions from TV media and the print media is that by lifting the embargo and by offering Castro certain temptations or certain steps to eventually remove the embargo, we will promote democracy in Cuba. This view, I believe, is void of critical understanding and analysis of the history of Cuba and its relation with other countries. For many years, Cuba has had relations with Mexico, Europe, many other countries. They have attempted through trade and through economic relations to influence change in Cuba. They have not been able to succeed. It's very arrogant for the US government to believe that by engaging Castro in economic relations, they will be able to succeed. I believe that what we need to do is continue the embargo because now they are really feeling. To engage Castro in full dialogue now and to lift the embargo would give him what many writers and thinkers on this have thought is to give Castro an opportunity to create a Chinese model in the Western Hemisphere, which is economic development but without political freedom. That's exactly what the US says is not promoting. And I think that the US media has not portrayed that argument fairly and objectively, and they have not allowed that kind of argument into the mainstream press as much as they should. Our experiences with China should be a very illustrative. They should have already have explained the point to us that by engaging in large-scale economic relations does not necessarily produce betterment of human rights in that country. We've seen that. I don't want a Tiananmen Square in Cuba. And I don't believe that by lifting the embargo and offering those kinds of incentives, we will see the change that we want to see in Cuba, which is democratic system established.